Hello, welcome to another video from the town of Monument. Today we're going to be giving you an introduction to composting. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into composting, but I will be mentioning something called the soil food web, which is sort of essential to composting. So let's start with what is compost? Well, compost is decomposing organic matter. It's just about anything that came from nature. It could be a woody product or a farmer's leftovers after harvest, all of the rest of the plant that's in the field. It could be animal waste that came from a plant-eating animal, such as horses or cows. And previously it was a waste product, but whenever you decide to compost it, you turn it into something very useful, which is what nature does usually when if we don't do anything with it, nature will go ahead and take care of it and compost it down. Compost is often used as a soil conditioner. I use this word conditioner. You can imagine the hair conditioner you use in the shower. It makes your hair softer and especially helps it to hold in moisture. So in the sense of soil conditioner, it really improves the structure of the soil, and it definitely helps it to retain moisture. And structure is everything for plants' abilities to grow its roots in there, and the ability to hold water is also really important, especially in our climate. Now, compost would not necessarily be classified as a fertilizer for soil because it does have some nutrition in it, but it's really slowly over time, and so fertilizers are usually kind of a quick release, instant effect type of a thing. What compost does have is all of these beneficial live organisms that were responsible for breaking down, for decomposing this organic matter, and that would be bacteria, your fungi, your actinomycetes, which is a form of fungi, of bacteria, sort of a special kind of bacteria, and all of these guys, when they are carried with the compost that you apply to your soil, excuse me, are going to help your plant actually to take more nutrition from the soil that it would not have been able to without that. And so these are your allies in the soil, and when you add compost, you are adding these allies with it. A term that you might want to know is humus. That's not hummus, that's humus, and that's the term for finished stable compost. So there's sort of like when things are decomposing still, you have compost, it's the compost pile, but when it's all finished and ready to incorporate into the soil, it's humus. That's that really valuable black gold that people really get excited about. And out in nature, humus is the organic component of soil, so some soils naturally have more humus than others. Here in our neck of the woods in Monument, our soils tend to be very lean and there's not as much organic matter, not as much humus in there. So why would we want to compost? That's really a big question. Why? Why would I want to go through the trouble of separating out one more thing from my garbage? I already recycle. Why should I do one more thing? Well, I'm gonna read this quote from Cornell University. They say it best: composting provides a way not only of reducing the amount of waste that needs to be disposed of, but also converting it into a product that is useful. And it really is useful. Boy, it improves soil structure, which in our neck of the woods here in Monument, Colorado, our structure, we kind of joke about it as being like concrete. And anything that can improve soil structure will help that plant to grow more easily and be more healthy. Along those same lines, it increases plant nutrient uptake. And so, I had said that it doesn't exactly qualify as a fertilizer, but what it does is it's carrying all those beneficial microorganisms that is going to reach out into the soil and deliver things to the plant that the plant would not have been able to get on its own. And that creates a more resilient landscape. Your landscape will be more resilient to drought and to crazy temperature fluctuations. Your plants will be able to heal faster after some sort of a crisis, such as a hailstorm or a wind event and things like that. And also it's cheap. Boy, I just love that about compost. It's something that you were going to throw away anyway, so why not save it and turn it into this really useful product? And at the same time, it's beneficial for the environment. Because it's a form of recycling, it reduces landfill waste, and you might be surprised how much of what goes into your trash can, especially from your kitchen, mostly from your kitchen, is what is filling up your trash can every week. And that's most of the stinky stuff. And when you compost it, it stops being stinky, and your trash can doesn't fill up as fast either. And when we talk about reducing landfill waste, my friend from Mr. Hawking from Metro Vancouver, I think he puts it really well. So I'm gonna play a video for you that he was nice enough to let me to share with me.
Hi, I'm David Hawking, and I'm from Metro Vancouver. People have asked me, why should I compost my food scraps? Why can't I just throw them in the garbage? Because after all, they'll go to a landfill and they'll become part of the soil, right? Well, not quite. Actually, there's a big difference between whether we compost our food scraps or we put them in the garbage. Let's talk first about composting. All right, so we grow some broccoli. We need some broccoli to eat. We grow some broccoli, and when we do that, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the air around it. The carbon in the broccoli comes from the air around it. Then, when we eat it, we leave some behind, perhaps the stem. And that stem, if we put it into a compost situation, we leave it for delivery to a compost facility, or we put it in our own composter in our backyard, it gradually decomposes and becomes soil. But it also gives off carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide, that's a greenhouse gas, isn't it? Won't that cause global warming? Well, actually, no. Because that carbon dioxide that's gone into the atmosphere is actually the same carbon dioxide that got absorbed from the air in the first place. So in terms of its effect on the atmosphere, there's none whatsoever. Now, if we compare that to what happens if we throw the food in the garbage. If we throw it in the garbage and it goes into a landfill, and here's the surface of the earth with a landfill right here, it gets covered up. And it has to decompose without oxygen. When it does that, it gives off a gas called methane. And this methane heads off up into the atmosphere. Now, methane, like carbon dioxide, is a greenhouse gas, actually 20 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide and methane are forming a blanket around the surface of the earth that absorbs some of that heat from the sun. And that blanket is thickening more and more, so that instead of it just being a warming effect, it's now becoming hot. And it's making the earth too hot. So that when we throw our food in the garbage, we're actually turning the planet hotter and hotter. We don't intend to, but that's a result of what we're doing. So my advice, don't throw your food scraps in the garbage, put them in the compost instead.
So I said that I would mention the soil food web. What is it that causes all this organic material to decompose? Well, it's actually this really complicated web, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I wanted to show a picture of these critters and things because these are your composters. I would hate for anyone to panic when they see things in their compost pile, such as a centipede or a slug, or of course earthworms, are usually welcome. I think we all know that earthworms are healthy for the soil. But this is really pretty amazing. It's a very intricate, it's not a chain, it's a web because it's so complicated. So some of the biggest, bulkiest stuff that needs to be broken down, it gets broken down first by bacteria and fungi. And then there are things that eat those things: protozoa, roundworms, beetles, mites, springtails. And then there are larger things that eat those. Bigger beetles, there are mites, there's centipedes, things that feast on these, and on and on. We could continue all day talking about this chain because then birds eat those. But eventually everything ends up, if you're composting, then what you're doing is completing that cycle and letting all of those nutrients that are traveling through the bodies of first bacteria, then protozoa, then an ant, then centipede, things like that, you're allowing it to go back to the earth that had invested all of those nutrients and materials in the first place. And when it goes into a landfill, it is not returned to the soil. So there was quite an investment that went into growing these plants that get kind of sent out into the world in these different forms, and then never returns when we don't compost it and return it to the soil. So what happens is the soil gets more and more depleted. But in this case, all of our friends, the composters, would help us out and basically break it down back into soil, and especially valuable soil. And so it's just a nutrient recycling process. And whenever you compost, you're allowing that process to be completed. You're kind of putting that last step of the circle back in place. So let's talk about the how now. What a compost pile will need is these essential ingredients. They're pretty basic. It needs oxygen. In an oxygen-free environment, that's called anaerobic, and that's the kind of an environment you find in a landfill. It's been covered over, there's no air exchange, and what you get is, without oxygen, maybe it's too wet, or because it's been covered over, if there's too much moisture, then it becomes stinky, and if it's covered over, then there's no more oxygen and turns to methane. That process of composting turns into a methane producing process. So you always want oxygen in your pile in order to avoid that. You also want moisture, because a dry pile, you don't want too much moisture, but you want moisture. A dry pile just will be very slow to decompose, because those wonderful composters that start the process, that are the first step in the process, which is our bacteria and our fungi and our actinomycetes, they need the moisture to move around in and to survive in. And so that's the next step, is we need microbes and composting insects. You don't necessarily have to inoculate your pile. Some people worry that they have to put something in their pile to get it started, but there's naturally in the world, there's always the microbes that you would need. Just always present in everything, especially if you're starting a compost pile directly on the soil, on existing soil. Those microbes will already be in existence. And the composting insects know how to find that stuff. And then the next thing you need is browns and greens. I did that again. So browns and greens, what do we mean by that? I think that anybody who talks about compost, they'll talk about, oh, you have too many browns, or you have too many greens, something like that, right? Now, this isn't complicated, but it's important to know the difference between browns and greens when people say that. How do you classify a brown or a green? Browns are considered high carbon. The way I remember that is because cardboard is brown, and cardboard is very hard. Wood is brown, and these are the things that make them hard, is the carbon. They're high carbon things. Green is high nitrogen. Nitrogen is really good for plants, but you can't have a compost pile that is all high nitrogen things, because those are the things that get stinky in your trash. The greens are the things that whenever they compost without carbon, they get stinky and slimy. So what are the browns? Well, cardboard is a brown because it was made from wood, which is very high in carbon. Another thing that's a paper product, right, that originated from wood is paper egg cartons. The uncolored kind are the best to use if you're going to throw that in your compost. And when it comes to carbons, the smaller the pieces are, the faster our fungi can break it down. So bacteria are not good at breaking down high carbon things. The heroes of the browns are the fungi. And here I have a picture of the mulch in one of our gardens, and it has a lot of beneficial fungi. That's the mycelium. You see all that white webbing. That is not unhealthy. You might say, oh my gosh, my garden has an infection, it's molding. But no, what that fungi is doing, it's really happy. There's a lot of organic life in that soil, which I always am really happy to see. But if you see this, that just means that your soil is alive and healthy, and that it's hungrily eating your mulch, which means that maybe in next year or the year after you might have to add a little bit more mulch, because this is a natural process of healthy soil processing the mulch down, and it will also make your soil healthier. And leaves are a really great source of carbon too. Trees have an ability to pull nutrients from deeper layers in the soil than most other plants, and then they pull that into their leaves. So if you're bagging your leaves and throwing them away, letting the garbage man take it away and possibly to a landfill, what you're doing is throwing away a lot of nutrition that soil did have, that the tree dropped on the ground just for you to collect. And you can either mulch it with your lawnmower and leave it on your lawn to return those nutrients directly to the soil, or you can collect the leaves and put it in your compost pile, and that will qualify as a brown material. to balance out with your greens. So what are greens? Well, they're the high nitrogen stuff. They're the stuff that, if you have the salad drawer in your fridge and some of those veggies and the lettuce starts to go bad, it does start to get kind of slimy and stinky, and that's the greens that are in the process of decomposing without any balance. They're out of balance. So grass clippings are definitely a high nitrogen thing. If you've ever forgotten to spread out grass clippings, they stay in a trash can for a while. Boy, does that start to stink. It actually will become anaerobic, and that's what creates the bad smell. That's actually the bad bacteria that's taking over. So you want to spread that out, get some air in it, and mix in some browns. Here's a pile of kitchen scraps, and kitchen scraps tend to mostly be greens. The eggshell is kind of a neutral thing. It's just full of calcium and minerals, and so it doesn't really qualify as either, but eggshells are good to throw in the compost. They will eventually break down and demineralized by all those organisms. Coffee grounds are almost neutral, but most people would say that they tend to be on the green side because they do have higher nitrogen. I'm not sure that I have noticed one way or the other, but they're a nice bulky thing you can add to your compost, and your compost pile won't mind a bit. Now, manures are kind of tricky because some of our most tenacious weeds can survive in the guts of the plant-eating animals, such as horses and goats and llamas and cows. And if that manure, if you don't have a very, very hot pile that can kill the weeds and kill some of the pathogens that are in there, some of the bad bacteria that we find in animal wastes, then you could have some of those pathogens at the end of your finished compost. And so generally we don't recommend that people in a small household pile, single family household, that they would put animal wastes in there. And you especially never want to put in animal feces from a meat-eating animal, such as a cat or a dog. Those qualify as meat-eating animals, and they have pretty high levels of pathogens, pathogenic to human beings. So if you have a farm with a really large pile, you can usually, farmers are usually pretty used to putting in their horse manure, and they have these really hot piles, so that tends to be more acceptable. So what is the right ratio of these carbon to nitrogen, browns to greens? Well, it's about a 2-to-1, and so soil experts would say it's actually more like 30-to-1, but anything that qualifies as a green will actually still have plenty of carbon in it. And so if you're thinking of if you're holding things in your hand and you're thinking, how much of this do I need or how much of this do I need, think of a 2-to-1. And that kind of a balance is sort of when I like to sort of relate it to cooking. It becomes kind of instinctual where, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not rocket science, but they just need to be a little bit in balance. You can kind of sometimes tell if you have too many greens or too many browns. Don't let it intimidate you. It's more like making a casserole or a salad. And I say that because every good casserole has probably more pasta than anything else. You can think of the sauce as the moisture content, right? You don't want a casserole that's too dry. But there's pasta, and then there's some other things, maybe some broccoli or some meat, something that there is less of. There's not usually the same amount of both. In a salad is the same way. There's usually more lettuce than there are the big chunky veggies. If you had a salad that had more vegetables than lettuce, you might think it was kind of a strange salad, right? So think of this carbon to nitrogen ratio, the browns to greens, as like that. You have more browns than greens, and that will maintain just about the right balance that those bacteria and fungi need to do that process. And the reason is because the process of breaking down carbon, it uses some nitrogen in that process, and the nitrogen will need to use some carbon in the process. And if they're balanced in this 2-to-1 ratio, then everything gets what it needs, everything is sustained and fed, and it breaks down very quickly and in a very balanced way. So here are some ways of composting. I have a few different ways. This is also something that is meant to give you the feeling that you have a lot of options, that there's no one right way to compost your kitchen scraps or anything else. Depending on your situation, there's some different options. Maybe you don't have a lot of space. Maybe you don't have a yard with a fence. Maybe you have concerns about wildlife, attracting wildlife. Maybe you live in the city. So I'm going to start first with a worm bin. This is also called vermicomposting, and because verma is for worms, and it can be done in a garage. You want to keep the temperature kind of steady. You don't want to set this bin in the sun where the worms are going to bake. And what you get is the worms will eat up all of the things you throw into the bin, and their castings, which is their worm poop, is actually somehow comes out more nutritious on the other side than the food that went into it. And it's this sort of a magical thing. I'm not, researchers are not exactly sure how that works. Maybe some of the smarter ones are. So I do have to mention, though, that this really kind of bothers me, this picture, because what you're looking at is a bin that has all greens. There's no carbon, there's no browns in there, such as maybe some people use shredded newspaper, for their browns, and balances it out. And what you would get with just greens on this pile is you might get some fungus gnats, also known as fruit flies. They would love that, and you'd get a bad smell because all of those greens would turn slimy probably within a day, before the worms would have a chance to be munching on it and processing it. And so you don't want to have this situation. You actually, if you have that amount of kitchen scraps, you want to have, of course, another 60% of that of some sort of a papery, carbony product mixed in there with it. And the worms will also eat that. So what happens is they eventually eat it, and at the bottom collects all of this castings, which is just really good for incorporating into your soil. It's actually possibly more nutritious for the plants than regular finished compost, also known as humus. So this is a good option if you can sort of keep the moisture and the balance just right in there. That's a good option for people who don't have a lot of space. Another term that people use is hot composting. This is a really active process, not just active in there with all the microbes and stuff. It's very the temperature actually rises as the bacteria do their work, and so that's why you see this steam coming out. A really hot pile is going to break down really quickly and turn into compost very quickly. But I also sort of call it an active process because you have to be really active. You actually really get a good exercise, and you have to maybe turn this pile as often as once a week. And so it's really active for you and for the microbiology in there. And the reason that it is so fast is because you're constantly aerating that pile. You're giving it a lot of oxygen, and it sort of increases the activity. It speeds it up. It energizes it, and you can get finished compost in as little as 6 weeks. Now, here in Colorado, that would have to be during the summer months. In the winter, it just would not be able to get warm enough, even if you were turning it once a week. It would probably, in the middle of winter, it would probably lose just as much heat in the process of turning as it had. And so I would say, turn your pile as often as you can, because it will always help to speed it up. But most people don't have the time to really have this hot composting process where you're monitoring it. You're saying, okay, the temperature is just right where I need to turn it again. But it is a bacterially dominated process, and that's because the bacteria is doing the bulk of the work when you're turning it that often. So it tends to be higher than other processes that are more passive. The lazy composting method that I like tends to end up with just a slightly lower level of nutrition in the end that's immediately available to plants, but it's still long-term would be available. Here's another one. I really like this. I really like what you get with this. leaf mold. This isn't spelled the way that it sounds, but it's called mold, where you take a big pile of leaves and you contain them, you keep them from blowing all over town. And in our climate, it might take more than a year, but at least one season it will be broken down by fungus, and that's fungus because it's a high carbon material, and it eventually will turn into a certain kind of compost that is more fungally dominant, and that tends to be better for the perennial plants, the plants that stick around a long time, which of course makes sense because trees are used to their leaves composting right underneath them and turning back into the soil and then feeding that tree everything that it needs to thrive. And so leaf mold is especially good for those long-lived landscapes with trees and shrubs. They'll especially appreciate the leaf mold. But it's also just a great thing to incorporate into a larger pile. Leaves are always a really great thing to contribute. And leaf mold is really great for moisture retention. It can actually hold up to 500% of its own weight in water. That's once it's completed. So I really do love that. And it's very passive. You just put it in there and you don't turn it. This isn't the kind of a thing you have to turn. You just put it in there and forget about it, unless it's maybe next year to throw more on top. Here's my favorite. This is what I call the lazy composting. But generally it's called lasagna composting. You don't tend to turn this very often. It's kind of just whenever you can get to it, you turn it. But what you will do is you will just always make sure that the layers are sort of balanced. So anytime you throw some greens in your pile, you'll also add that amount of browns, the 2-to-1 ratio, so a little bit more browns than greens. And I like this because it tends to, the stuff coming out of my kitchen tends to be mostly green, and I bring that out to the compost pile, and then I grab a handful of straw or leaves, whatever I have, and I put that on top, and then I usually have something to lay over the pile, some sort of hardware cloth that keeps it from blowing away. And then I just continue to layer that, and then it might only be 2 or 3 times during the year that I have a chance to turn that pile and mix it all up, but all those organisms in the pile will be doing the work for you. It's just a slower process. And then this is, about as nerdy as I'm going to get, and I don't want to bore you with the details, but we talk about a temperature getting hot. There are good bacteria that are responsible for the composting process, and some of them are heat-loving, so those are your thermophilic. And what's cool is if you can get your pile hot enough, then they are the ones that will be active during that process, and all of the pathogenic things that we would worry about, such as salmonella, are going to die at those temperatures. And so that is really a benefit to getting your pile hot enough, and you know that it will be killing certain pathogens, but there are plenty of good bacteria that can survive that and will continue composting. When they are done and they have consumed everything they can consume, they're sort of ready to retire, the pile cools down and other bacteria will take over at that point. And so if you have a really hot pile, what you'll see the temperature rising, it will be maintained, and then it eventually will drop. And people who are maintaining hot piles, they sort of tend to, they monitor it often, and they make sure that they are keeping it hot for the period of time that they know that they need in order to complete the compost really fast. And I won't get too deep into that, but it is good to know that compost can get hot enough to kill most bad bacteria, and weed species that you wouldn't want to survive into your compost. Here's a quick product that people use if they are using hot compost, is this really long thermometer. It sort of looks like a meat thermometer, but it's even longer, and it will tell you how hot your pile is right in the center without you having to peel back the layers and sort of expose that center of the pile. So let's do some troubleshooting really quick. Here's some common things that tend to go wrong. Composting is really pretty easy, and there's really only a few things that might go wrong, and so let's talk about those. Let's say your pile smells bad. Well, compost should never smell bad, even when it's not completed. Completed compost smells really earthy and actually just, it's one of the best smells. It's almost like you're in a forest. But in the process, it also should smell pretty good. If your pile smells bad, that means that it's out of balance for some reason. It either has too much nitrogen, so it needs some more carbon elements added. Maybe it needs to be turned or mixed better, get some oxygen in there. Or your pile is too wet, which is also going to cause a lack of oxygen. And that can be helped. You kind of circle back around to this. If your pile's too wet, you add more carbon. If your pile has too much nitrogen, you add more carbon, and you turn it and mix it and get some oxygen in there. And then let me skip down to this, because here's the opposite problem. My pile isn't heating up. Well, it might have too much carbon because it won't quite get, it might be the carbon to nitrogen ratio might not be right, but it also might not be an issue because it actually could be that your pile is completing that part of the cycle. It just might be cooling off because it's done with the thermophilic phase. And so I wouldn't always expect it to heat up. My lasagna method, of lazy composting hardly ever gets hot enough to kill pathogens. That's why I have to be careful what I put in there. Weather can be kind of an issue, right? The wind is blowing away your ingredients. The snow and the rain is making it waterlogged. You can consider using what's called a compost cover or a compost blanket, sort of this wool, tightly woven thing that helps maintain just the right moisture in your pile, and it keeps the ingredients warmer. It helps, keep it more active even during the summer months. You can also build a nice burley bin or a cage that can help keep animals out of it and also keep things in your pile from blowing away. But it would have to be pretty burly. In our area, we do have bears and raccoons and things that will want to carry off stuff, or even bears would even want to just walk away with your barrel if you have one of those tumblers. So when I'm speaking of troubleshooting, I thought that I would show this picture because this is a really lovely picture when you're trying to appeal to someone to compost, but it actually kind of bothers me because here we have that problem again. Look at all those greens. There's no browns. I'm not sure how this person got that kind of compost with that. So always maybe have an eye out if you see a pile like this. That's all kitchen scraps. Those are all green things that came from plants. It's very wet, and very quickly it's going to turn slimy and stinky. And so you'll want to mix in some browns with that. And so let's see if okay, here's a picture of a compost blanket. This is a really large composting operation, probably a business that sells compost, and they have these really large blankets covering it that when they're not mixing it, they cover it up, and it helps to just contain all of that and keep everything in there happy and healthy. And that concludes our presentation on composting. Hope you all feel confident enough to try this out yourself at home. Everyone take care. Until next time, bye-bye.